Continuing our week one recaps, that is what we were doing today on RotoViz Overtime. A lot to talk about. Obviously, recording this one post Monday Night Football. We have the Aaron Rodgers injury, we have Breece Hall's performance, we have what it means for Garrett Wilson with his insane touchdown grab last night. Lots more, including the games that we didn't cover when we did our recap on the Monday edition. Shawn, a tough week, an interesting week. I mentioned it to you before we started. We got over the line in our main event and our Dynasty Reanimators team, both winning this week. So they're off to good starts. But the one thing I want to mention at the start of the show is we recorded the recap. We recorded at 6:30 my time, Shawn, very late at night, your time, approaching midnight. And we may have sounded groggy, tired, maybe less enthusiastic. But that was all down to a lot of different factors. But we had people reach out, Shawn, to say, you know, thanks for all the stuff that we have done throughout the year. They won this week, how their teams went. And I just wanted to take a moment to shout out the RotoViz Overtime community for their support, both to us, because it obviously means a lot when people reach out for those reasons. You're kind of with, when you do these shows, Shawn, with your work on the website, sometimes you're wondering if people are going to reach out and say, I lost this week because of what you said. You know, you cost me my entire fantasy season. And for me, anyway, that's a bit of a fear when you go into these NFL Sundays to see what happens. But when the week maybe doesn't go as well for some of the players that I know, I hype up T. Higgins a lot, for example, and he is a 0, and you know Drake London is a 0, and so on. For people to reach out with support like that towards us is means a lot. So I thank everyone who did reach out. But Shawn, week one was only the beginning. We are ready to crush the rest of the season, but we need to talk about how week one impacts what is moving forward. And I think the only place that we can start with is going to be the New York Jets against the Buffalo Bills, the Aaron Rodgers injury, and what that means for the rest of the season. And a teaser, I guess, for later in the show, we are going to play a clip of the Garrett Wilson touchdown, a clip of the Breece Hall run from Monday Night Football, because we're trying to put together what people have suggested for the new intro clip. So a couple of those coming up towards the end of today's show to finish it off in positive formats. But when we look, Shawn, this game kicks off, and pretty much instantly we have a situation where Aaron Rodgers is down. Aaron Rodgers is injured. It doesn't look good immediately, and it leads to today being confirmed that it is a torn Achilles tendon, which is a brutal injury. And we had a few comments even on the YouTube video that went up today with you and Ben doing your recap, talking about the J.K. Dobbins injury, and people saying that it really resonated again for them when they were listening to your breakdown of the Dobbins side of things and thinking about it from the Aaron Rodgers perspective as well. But the Jets do go on and win 22-16. So a lot to get into here. I just want to start by, you know, Aaron Rodgers no longer with the Packers. This is devastating news for me as a Aaron Rodgers supporter. We don't take it up on the show, Shawn, as much because we joke about it. Rodgers was quite a controversial figure over the last couple of seasons, but you know, somebody who I have watched for most of my NFL watching life, and to think that this could possibly be the end of his NFL career is very disappointing for me. But also, if you think about it from his perspective, making the move, from the Jets fans' perspective, I'm devastated for the Jets fans for how this has turned out, just, you know, a couple of plays into his career there. So very disappointing from that perspective. But they do get the win, Shawn. Breece Hall, I thought, looked fantastic, has a 83-yard run. If he doesn't start it in his own end zone, he's probably in for a touchdown. Looks electric on that. Looked electric on a number of other plays. Did have a fumble. Probably should protect the ball a little bit better on that. But I was just, in terms of a week one performance from Breece Hall, who we'll start off with, I don't think week one could have looked better from him from a health perspective. The one downside people are looking at is that he didn't get into the end zone on that rush attempt. But he goes for 83 yards. You're not usually practicing 100-yard rushes to get to the end zone. And with the athletic moves that he made on the way to do that, you know, I think maybe there is that he's at 80% and he gets there when he's back to 100%. We'll see what happens as he continues to get healthier this season. The one thing I will shout out, we talked about Travis Etienne and how he managed to, you know, make that block for Calvin Ridley this past weekend. Chase Claypool's coming in for a lot of heat online for his work ethic, and the Bears lost to the Packers. Garrett Wilson, I think, could make a block here to give Breece Hall a couple of extra yards and maybe get to the end zone. But Breece Hall, Shawn, week one thoughts. Hit me with them.
Yeah, you gave us a long intro and setup there.
I was trying to cover 10 topics and didn't know what direction to take it, but
no, I appreciate it. You did a wonderful job. And the first thing is just, it's really touching to hear that people reached out about the first show. And it's always kind of funny too, because when we do the show, at least in part, you're thinking, okay, well, I'm going to pull back into myself a little bit here and, make sure like all of the raw emotions aren't on display. But sometimes when you do that, it still is pretty obvious kind of how you're feeling.
The other part I mentioned just to you before we started recording is when like we think a lot of the people listening and their teams and what it means to their teams. And we don't want to like just brush over that. And sometimes it can be like cathartic if you're a J.K. Dobbins drafter and your team had a tough day and you tune into the RotoViz Overtime podcast rather than somebody just brushes over it and seems like they don't care to give the emotion or the depth of it that you did on both Stealing Bananas. And you recorded Stealing Bananas before we recorded OT. So you had a long run of podcasting in that short space of time.
And I really enjoyed getting a chance to talk with both you and Ben. It just means a lot to me to be able to chat with my best friends in the aftermath of what was a wonderful day of football too. I mean, that part, we certainly want to get out there. And then obviously some of the unfortunate things that happen and your heart just goes out to the various players. I guess I don't have the same reaction that you have on Aaron Rodgers he's so thoroughly embraced the role of villain. I mean, he's somebody who is a pretty strong believer in alternative medicine, right? So perhaps there are solutions here that the mainstream medical community is not thinking about for this Achilles tear. But it's devastating for the New York Jets. And one of the things that Ben and I discussed on Stealing Bananas is that it's really hard to lose someone like a J.K. Dobbins because he was going to have an extraordinary season. And you're talking about a guy who, probably averages like 15 points per game. Maybe he comes in a little bit under that if you think the offense ends up being really spread or you think they just limit him for whatever reasons. There's a pretty decent possibility that he ends up with, 18 to 20 points per game. And you're not going to be able to just, brush over that and say that opportunity out of your lineup, and especially when you think about how you hammer people on the bye weeks and all of those types of things, those points are going to be missed. And it's not just no big deal. And yet there are still plenty of ways that your team could be really, really good. Garrett Wilson demonstrated in that game last night why we felt comfortable. I had taken him as high as 106. And certainly Austin Eckler looked fantastic in week 1. And I think that the Los Angeles Chargers were one of the more interesting and impressive teams, although once you take that against some different defenses, they are going to have to pass the ball better. And they're going to need to get more out of Quentin Johnston. But anybody who took Austin Eckler and thought that was a very clear-cut selection over Garrett Wilson, I certainly have no problem with that at all. Austin Eckler is one of my favorites. But I think that we saw, even with Zach Wilson last night, why Garrett Wilson was primed to be a guy who's going to join Justin Jefferson at the very top. And so I think that was the right decision. You look at what happened in week 1, and you're almost thinking, okay, the mistake pick is probably Jamar Chase. And if Aaron Rodgers stays healthy, Garrett Wilson has a really good chance to outscore Chase and to be up there in that group with Hill and Jefferson. Now that's just completely and totally impossible because you're not going to get anything like that volume, and you're not going to get the potential for the efficiency. I mean, we talk through the years. I don't think that Aaron Rodgers was this version of himself anymore. I mean, one of the first things you think when you're watching that play, even before you realize he's injured, is throw the ball away. Why are you going to risk that hit? You're not going to get away from that defender. You're no longer that player. Throw the ball away. I mean, you got to take the Tom Brady path sometimes of just getting rid of it.
Watching Packers games, that is what Rodgers does. The difference was he had David Bakhtiari on the at left tackle.
So anyway, that part, I mean, I didn't have the same emotional reaction last night, I think, because within a tight window of time, there are maybe only so many extreme emotional reactions that you can have. Being still a little bit broken from Sunday. But the Garrett Wilson thing here is worse because, I mean, this is now going to be like the Kyle Pitts situation where you have an extraordinary player who is the foundation piece for a lot of what you want to accomplish, and he's going to be completely and totally neutralized. And you've got to keep putting him in there because, I mean, you're not going to win your league and you're not going to win the title. You're not going to win the $1 million with your first round pick on the bench. I mean, maybe you will. I mean, I've mentioned that some of my best teams have had some of the biggest players out and guys who were drafted in 6, 7, and 8, plus maybe a free agent. You know, think back to that season, 2013. I mean, Keenan Allen, rookie, free agent pickup after week 1, and I mean, had a big year. So there are some paths here, but there's no way to like downplay this and say, oh, just, see what happens and, it'll be, more or less okay. I mean, Garrett Wilson's actually still going to be good too. I mean, that's the thing where you're going to obviously keep playing him because, I mean, he's going to score in that 13 to 15 point per game range, which is very, very playable. I mean, you think about all of the teams that we had and that I had with lots of other managers where, and it's different in week 1 because there are such wide open workload ranges, right? And you don't know. And as we get into the season, you're going to have a better sense of what the workload is and how that projects and where you're going to want to put the points. But we had a lot of situations where we're thinking about, okay, 11 points from Rashee Rice. Who do you plug him in for so you get that kind of floor with the lineup? I mean, obviously Garrett Wilson's scoring will play, but I mean, he was going to challenge 20, 21, 22 points per game. Colm, you mentioned, I mean, the good news is that not every team has Garrett Wilson. Not every team has J.K. Dobbins. Certainly plenty of teams don't have either one of them. You and I were fortunate enough that our main event doesn't have either one of them and scored 163 points, 1 going away. There was actually a team that outscored us, so we are just in second. But I mean, there are lots of wonderful things that are still going to happen.
There's lots of wonderful things, Shawn, and you're usually the one that brings the optimism. But this week it's going to be me because I'm going to say Zach Wilson is one of the worst quarterbacks in the NFL. He is now, at this moment in time as we record, going to be the starting quarterback for the New York Jets. But there is a lot of bad quarterbacks in the NFL, much better quarterback than I am, but we do see fantasy production from their wide receivers. And Garrett Wilson is an elite talent, and he may not go the route of being able to, get there with a Justin Jefferson or a Jamar Chase for the rest of the season. But I still think that he is right there. And I think he can still challenge the A.J. Brown tier of wide receivers. Now, it's going to take a lot of play that we're not expecting from Wilson, and it's going to take them, not just completely reverting into the Falcons style of offense where it's all going to be Breece Hall and Dalvin Cook. But I think there's the two of those things in our minds with how disappointed probably we are and what the Falcons are look like they are going to continue to do this season. And then with this happening, we may be like putting them both into the one picture. And I don't necessarily think that will be exactly the case. I'm willing to let it play out. The high of the highs is probably not there now with Wilson, but 15 to 20 points, not every single week, but on a relatively consistent basis, I think is still there. We don't get the Tyreek Hill game, for example, but I think that we get very usable weeks throughout the season, which is disappointing.
Where
for
would
the
you
first round
select
pick.
him? Where would you select him if you knew that Zach Wilson was going to be his quarterback?
Probably at the 2-3 turn, and that's probably higher than you're thinking about taking him, is it? Like we're taking like T. Higgins, we're taking Devontae Smith, the secondary options on those offenses around that point in general. That's kind of where I'm taking him. I would maybe take Debo over him, but I would still be like taking him ahead of Keenan Allen, for example, who's in the mid to late third.
Yeah, I think that that's probably right. And we talked all season about how there was a hard tier break after T. Higgins. And I still think that that's probably the case. You're going to get a few hits from the rest of that group. It was kind of funny. And I mean, it was in some ways like a fun note and a relief, but also you're just like, I mean, it doesn't indicate like anything. When I was going back through and I was looking at some of the previous targets over the last couple of days to kind of, make sure I was contextualizing my recommendations, thinking through what happened, where we want to go forward. And you see that the 39 priority targets article has Brandon Ayuk as the image for it. And you're like, oh, that's a pretty lucky image selection because that's a good one to highlight.
For week one, yeah.
We didn't mention this
on the recap show. His second touchdown, the control of his body to get his feet down there and to maintain control of the ball is exceptional.
He's good. I mean, he's really good. One of the things that's just so crazy and so frustrating, I think, about fantasy scoring, and I say that and not saying like, oh, it should be changed or, oh, like the people who drafted a certain player and avoided a certain player, like shouldn't get credit for that. I mean, people know what the format is. So, but I mean, you think about Brock Purdy and what he did this last week and where he scored from a fantasy perspective. And then you think about some of the quarterbacks who outscored him significantly, who had terrible games. And so it is unfortunate there. And it's unfortunate for some of the 49ers who maybe didn't benefit as much. One of the things that I really liked in that game, though, is that the workload was very concentrated between the 4 stars. And so, I mean, you're going to get big games from Debo. You're going to get big games from George Kittle. Obviously, in week 1, you got massive games from Christian McCaffrey and Brandon Ayuk. This was an offense that we talked about how we actually wanted plenty of exposure to all 4 guys because unlike almost any other situation in the NFL, those guys were so good. The offense was going to be efficient. You're going to have massive spike weeks across the board there. So the reason that I thought of that is that as we're talking about where you would draft a Garrett Wilson, I still think that I would, strongly prefer to have him over most of those receivers in the 3-4 range. I mean, certainly you watch week 1 and I mean, Colm, it's tough because I mean, DJ Moore and Drake London, like completely in a vacuum, would be 2 of my favorite players. I only have a couple of shares of them across like 90 best ball teams and certainly 0 in managed leagues because it didn't seem like there was any way that you could draft them with some of the other options that were available. I mean, that feels right after week 1, but it's not something where you're like, oh, I had this right, blah, blah, blah. It's something where you're just devastated for them. And you're like, run the offense in a different way. Like, you got to do something different.
I have an interesting thought that just came out. Maybe for me, it's interesting, maybe not for anyone listening, or maybe not for you, but you asked me the question about where we would take Garrett Wilson. Where would you take Breece Hall today? So are we basically flipping ADPs for Breece Hall and Garrett Wilson?
One of the things that I think it's important to keep in mind, and you had been asking about Breece Hall, and that's definitely a place that I want to go. I mean, one of the reasons why the Garrett Wilson thing last night was not as devastating is that it's offset, or you have this simultaneous just transcendent performance from a Breece Hall. And so I'm in the midst of writing like the longest article I've ever written for RotoViz. Some people like that. I mean, for some people it'll be too long. You can go to the individual teams to look at some of the things that are happening there. But in the intro that I may or may not leave in, I talk about the fact that for me right now, and there are so many amazing running backs, right? One of the people I didn't even really mention was a Jonathan Taylor, who I think is actually very similar. And if you can get an offensive situation where they're able to get him the ball in space as a receiver a little bit more naturally, a little bit more seamlessly, and you get a little bit of what Hall has done as a receiver, then I don't even think those two guys are that different. Certainly you look at what Bijan did in week 1, and it was mind-boggling. You think of, well, how does Bijan Robinson come in as a dynasty prospect and be locked into the 101 ahead of these 3 interesting quarterbacks and then 2 other, extremely impressive prospects in Jackson Smith and Jigba and Jahmyr Gibbs, especially when the situation in some ways isn't perfect with Tyler Algier there, because Tyler Algier was possibly the second best running back or the third best running back in week 1 after Bijan Robinson and Breece Hall. And yet you watch him play, and even knowing all of that, it's just, you don't see people move that way. It's extraordinary. But you think about Breece Hall, and we only have a couple of games or a handful of games from his rookie season, and then really just a couple of plays last night. So, this is hyperbole, but I mentioned in the article that sometimes hyperbole is like the only thing that really seems to capture a situation purely from a talent perspective, because obviously Breece Hall has many years of needing to generate production to be in the same mix with these players from a yardage perspective, from a success perspective, from actually having gotten the job done at the NFL level, as opposed to it being purely as potential. But as a football enthusiast, the only 2 players that I still think I would put like clearly above, or just, would be in that same mix from what we've seen already with Breece Hall. Again, handful of games last year, a couple of plays last night. The only 2 guys are Barry Sanders and Jamal Charles. And there have been...
Get that gold jacket now. Get that gold jacket.
There have been many, many great players. You think back to kind of the guys who were in between a Barry Sanders and a Jamal Charles, and you're talking about players like Marshall Faulk and LaDainian Tomlinson. Certainly right now, we have a Christian McCaffrey. So from that perspective, obviously you're excited that you have Breece Hall, but the idea that all of the concerns would go away, whether those concerns are Dalvin Cook, who rushed 13 times for 33 yards, or those concerns are just how your body continues to react, and if there are any compensatory issues that come up. You mentioned the long run. That, on the one hand, I was thinking the same thing, where when he doesn't go in, I'm screaming at the TV, because you're like, it's another 8 points if you finish that run, right? But
he'd run 83 yards at that point, Shawn. I don't know if I can run 83 yards.
Like just in one stretch.
In 1 hour.
You're going to jog, and then you're going to take a nap, and then you're going to walk the rest of the way to the refrigerator. Yeah, it was a beautiful play, and you would like to see some blocking maybe from his teammates. The thing is that the defenders are also trying. Some of them are going to have the angle. One of the things that we are pretty sure that we know about Breece Hall, which was one of the reasons that we did feel comfortable drafting him, is that his GPS results from practice were out of this world. So I don't think the long speed is necessarily an issue. This is not a case like last year with J.K. Dobbins, where he's breaking off these long runs and is like limping and waddling, and you're like, he just ran 50 yards and he can barely move. This wasn't that. Now, it's still very impressive what J.K. Dobbins did too, but he looks extraordinary. I don't know.
If he does that, obviously, at any other point of the game outside of when the ball is pretty much at the 1 yard line. So if it's a kickoff for, from a touchdown that goes for a touchback, it's at the 25 yard line, for example. Any other time in the game, the most you're really ever going to be running is 75 yards if you're going for a touchdown. He's in the end zone on those. And maybe the key here is for Breece Hall to maybe practice more runs from the 1 yard line all the way to the end zone for those 99-yard touchdowns.
Yeah, Tony Dorsett would be disappointed that he didn't finish that run. So, Tony Dorsett, another name from the
past,
the way back days. I'm going to go with Tony Dorsett as better than Ezekiel Elliott there as a Dallas Cowboy, which obviously no one is surprised by. Colm, I think you would draft him earlier, or you would feel comfortable drafting him in that range. There are some other good names. I mean, probably the most disappointing of our running back recommendations was a Ramondre Stevenson. And this is going to be, kind of the game that we go to next here. And yet he too looked very dynamic, especially on a couple of those receptions. He's very active in the receiving game. And one of the things I think is that even if you are really frustrated by the workload that Ezekiel Elliott got, which I personally am, it's flagrantly absurd. And yet it's still a big positive that there were so many targets to the running backs in this particular game. Elliott gets 7, Ty Montgomery gets 3, Ramondre Stevenson gets 6, and not surprisingly, Ezekiel Elliott goes for 14 yards on his 7 targets. So very explosive there. Ramondre Stevenson, 64 yards on his 6 targets. And again, I mean, that kind of thing always is going to depend a little bit on game context. When a quarterback targets you on a throwaway or when a defender is about to tackle you, you're not going to go for as much. And Elliott did have a few of those plays. The big breakaway play from Stevenson is one where it was set up, it was open. And so, there's a little bit of sarcasm about the gap between those guys from an efficiency perspective. The number one thing you like to see is that many targets to the running backs.
Yeah, and the one thing I would just note on that is it was 54 pass attempts in this for Mac Jones, which we're not going to see very often. I don't think that was part of the Patriots game plan. They get into a 16-0 hole in the to start the second quarter. So there is more passes, so that number is bumped up. But I do think that the other players who received additional targets are ones that maybe drop down a little bit. Like Boutte gets 4 targets going his way. Juju, who was really, Shawn, you've highlighted it obviously for a long time, really disappointing in this game. 7 targets for him, 4 receptions, 33 yards. But we get the tight ends in with 9 targets combined. I think Kendrick Bourne, Shawn, is somebody who deserves some highlighting in this game. He gets 11 targets, 6 receptions, 64 yards, 2 touchdowns going his way. He, out of the Patriots in terms of the wide receiver options, really stood out. Hunter Henry has 6 targets, 5 receptions, 56 yards and a touchdown for him. The other side of this, Shawn, is I think almost the Eagles got into such a comfortable position after that first quarter that they almost shut things down and then almost got caught again at the end. So, Jalen Hurts starts off this game really positively. They look great. We get the Devontae Smith touchdown earlier in the game. He goes 7 for 47 and a touchdown on 10 targets. We get 10 targets for A.J. Brown, 7 for 79 going his way. But it kind of just stops. The tap turns off at that particular point. The other keynote here, Shawn, would be the running back usage between Gainwell and DeAndre Swift, mainly Boston Scott and Swift, and kind of similar usage patterns here overall. But Swift gets 2 targets, 1 reception for no yards. He gets 1 rush for 3 yards. We get Kenneth Gainwell then 14 for 54 rushing. And then in the receiving game, gets 4 targets, 4 for 20 off that. Now, Gainwell has popped up on the injury report. It was his most usage in terms of snaps and touches in his NFL career. Maybe not the smartest usage off the running backs overall entering week 1 from the Eagles in a game which they were controlling for that point of it. It was obviously 16-14 at the half. I was obviously very surprised by the way they used this running back core. Rashad Penny was a healthy scratch going into this game. The drumbeat had been that Kenneth Gainwell was going to be the lead back, but I didn't expect it to be, in terms of a 14-1 between him, Scott, and Swift in this contest.
Yeah, that was surprising. And I want to highlight a couple of things and try and be precise with the way that I discuss it, because it's very important to not ever let any kind of sour grapes element sneak into how you're thinking or evaluating any of the elements, because then your ability to process the evidence and the logic that you use, the reasoning that you use as you work through it, is going to be corrupted. I was disappointed that Jahmyr Gibbs didn't play more for the Lions, and I was disappointed that DeAndre Swift didn't play more for the Eagles. But maybe not completely surprised, certainly by the Montgomery situation, in part because I kind of consider myself to be a stealth David Montgomery fan, in that if he had been a little bit less expensive, he would have found his way onto the 0 RB candidates countdown, because I think that his ability as a 3-down back and his ability to break tackles is a little bit understated at this point, based on the fact that the people who really liked him originally are disappointed that he hasn't emerged as a star, that he hasn't become closer to what Josh Jacobs is, which I certainly think is what they were hoping. And so one of the things that will happen is that if you lose your fierce advocates because they're the people who were burned by where you are or what you've done, then you're going to lose that group that is pushing you up and arguing for you as a strong player. So once you lose that, then you can almost sneak in there as an undervalued kind of guy. Now, that didn't quite happen this season, in part because obviously you have Gibbs there as well. And for me, the David Montgomery thing was purely a matter of there being a couple of really interesting names that I thought you had to draft in that same range that would push him out of it. The thing with Gainwell is also interesting because he was on the 0 RB candidates countdown in 2022. And I spent the entire first 6 weeks of last season being like, where is Kenneth Gainwell? He is better than Boston Scott. He's someone who brings an element that Miles Sanders doesn't bring. He's perfect for this offense. They've been talking him up. He's got good peripherals. Why is he not playing more? I mean, he is the guy that would make this work. So for him to come out and play like this in terms of getting the opportunity in week 1, especially after that's been reported, that's what's going to happen. Now, one of the things that we talk about quite a bit is you want to take some of these reports with a grain of salt, because very frequently, once you get into the NFL season, it doesn't manifest because the team is trying to sell themselves and sell you on a thesis that simply does not work. And I'm not saying that we're there with Kenneth Gainwell. Certainly, he got the workload that was being reported. I guess where I am with it, and I really wanted to make sure I was very clear on where I am with Montgomery and Gainwell before saying that I was pretty shocked at how both of them looked, because both of these offenses had the potential to be extremely high scoring. And I thought that in both cases, the reliance on backs who apparently don't bring as much to the table, or at least in the one game. I mean, it's one game and it's a handful of touches, even though it was a decent number of touches. There are all kinds of backs across the NFL who didn't demonstrate true playmaking ability in week 1, where we would still kind of expect them to be okay. The thing that did jump out to me, however, with week 1, kind of from a more global perspective. So if you're not interested in Kenneth Gainwell, you're not interested in DeAndre Swift, but also this Lions situation. But globally, you're thinking through the running backs. The guys that we talked about as being potential dead zone targets, like a Kenneth Walker, not a good fantasy day, but looked absolutely fantastic.
Yeah. Travis
Etienne, big fantasy day, and looked extraordinary.
Clip coming up later.
Clip coming up. James Cook, you could see what he was doing for the Bills, even though, I mean, you would like him to break a couple of those plays when he got into space, beat the one-on-one. Javonte Williams, disappointing, and yet you could see with him this elite combination of traits. Certainly a Breece Hall. Guys who have the ability to change games do matter. And then everybody else doesn't. So we think about the running back position. You think about RotoViz was at the birth of all of this. And Frank was very adamant at the beginning that, regardless of what you thought about zero RB from a fantasy perspective, that these running back heavy teams were killing themselves by giving the ball to their backs. And he was able to show that back in 2013. Obviously, there's been a ton of research since that very clearly points in the same direction. But I think that you can kind of get lost with that then. Whereas you think about the Vikings and how one-dimensional they were because their running back doesn't have anything that he brings to them. You think about the teams like the Jets, where, you mentioned, will they be like the Falcons? The only way that you can be like the Falcons is that you have to have that level of running back talent. And then if you're the Jets and you have a great defense, maybe you can make it work. When you're the Falcons, you're still going to generally be bad, except for the fact that maybe your schedule is super easy. But you work through this, and if you have a game-breaking back, and this is one of the reasons why the Colts don't want to move Jonathan Taylor, even though they also don't want to pay him, is that will make a difference. The things that Anthony Richardson brings to the table, if you also have a Jonathan Taylor, that offense becomes interesting. Right. So we kind of worked back through this, and one of the things that happened with the Lions is they gave so many touches to David Montgomery that were wildly counterproductive that the dynamism they had displayed in 2022 was not there. You look at this Eagles team, and Kenneth Gainwell looked bad. And I say that as someone who really likes him. He looked bad. And so I would still expect this team to get DeAndre Swift and Rashad Penny, two of the elite talents in the NFL, involved. Now, I say elite talents, but one of the reasons they were available for the Eagles that they also have these warts. And those warts don't just disappear because you're in the Eagles offense. They become the strengths become much more exciting. And I think that we're still going to see those. The warts are still there. We'll see what happens. But what happened with the Eagles in that game where they frankly looked bad and probably should have lost? And certainly what happened in Monday night with the Bills was this reminder that the NFL is played at an incredibly high level. And it was kind of funny because we spent the entire offseason having to figure out how we wanted to play the quarterback position. And the most clear-cut play was Tua, and it was the thing that we recommended the most heavily. However, if you play Tua on every single team, and what happened to Aaron Rodgers happens to him, then your entire season is done. And so you're going to have to play it some other ways as well. Now, one of the things I did want to mention quickly, again, just appreciate so much everything that the OT community did with the reviews. I was able to draft a team with Chandler. I was able to draft a team with Nick. We had David Philippi on the show, and he's been doing a little bit of content for the website. We have drawn two other names, Colm, and we've been thinking about things that we might still do. So in some ways, a portion of that contest is almost ongoing. And one of the things that I was thinking, I'll kind of throw this out there, see if this seems like something that would work, would be to draft a couple of the Underdog resurrection teams, whatever that contest is called, where 6 weeks in or what have you start again. Do a couple of those with the other names that we drew. But had a blast drafting with Chandler, had a blast drafting with Nick. Both of those teams did end up with Tua. Both of those teams did win in week 1. That obviously feels great. You get off to a very nice start there. Working back through this quarterback situation, it's, how do you play the elite QBs? How do you deal with that opportunity cost? How do you deal with the fact that outside of maybe Tua, then the QB window is not very exciting? One of the plays that I think was probably a good play, maybe the best play, was Aaron Rodgers, which that's going to get you 0 points for the entire season.
Mm-hmm.
So that play is gone. And then you think about the late guys, and the late guys were very much a mixed bag in that Sam Howell, I think especially once you've seen how Josh Allen played, how, certainly how Patrick Mahomes played, even though I guess I would put a lot of that on his receivers, how Jalen Hurts played, how Joe Burrow played. This is the worst game of Joe Burrow's career, and it's not even close. Then some of them kind of mixed results from either rookies or from young players like a Sam Howell become, more impressive in their own way. Certainly a thing where, you hope their coaches are realizing, okay, well, they made some pretty glaring errors, but not as many glaring errors as Josh Allen made. And we know that he is a star QB. That's not to say that I think that the elite QB thesis won't work for this season. If anything, because we know these guys are stars, it's something we almost don't even have to worry about that much. These guys are going to come back and score. The players who rely on them are probably going to come back and score. One of the things with T. Higgins is he has 8 targets and he has a huge number of air yards. And so, for everybody who loves the air yards buy low dynamic, he's the most clear-cut maybe pick that we've ever had. But you work through this and you see some of these guys at the back and you think about a Mac Jones. You mentioned that he's not going to throw this many passes most of the time. It is very problematic that he doesn't have receivers. Juju, as you mentioned, was disappointing. I do want to throw in a little note about Kendrick Bourne, because we do have these games in week 1, week 2 every season where a peripheral or tertiary, very deep receiver will go off for a big game, and they'll be the waiver wire flavor of the week, and then more or less nothing will be heard of them. You can even think to some of the games that, secondary guys on the Lions have had, in this sort of Jared Goff era, where in individual moments, you'll get a big game from a Josh Reynolds or from a Khalif Raymond or from, it's possible Marvin Jones will have a decent game at some point this year, even though I'm not optimistic there. But Kendrick Bourne, I think, is a little bit of a different animal in that in 2021, he had 800 yards and 5 touchdowns. And a huge chunk of that came, number one, a huge chunk of it came after the catch, 396. That part is kind of interesting because we know he can also get deep. But he had almost 60 fantasy points over expectation, which a lot of people are going to say, yeah, that's the perfect example of someone that you want to fade because that's not sustainable. And yet readers of the site will know from Blair's research that it's actually the kind of player that you want to target. 2022, this year in between, was a really weird year where, number one, the Patriots got horrific coaching, and number two, he seemed to bizarrely fall into the doghouse. And yet, unlike other guys in this offense, he's managed to make it through, is still on the team. He has a game here in week 1 where all of this production is not on like a couple of plays, right? He's got 11 targets. He's got 129 air yards, makes all of those catches, scores the multiple touchdowns. You're going to have Devontae Parker come back at some point. I guess I still think that Tyquan Thornton is probably going to be involved in this offense. The 2 late round rookies in Demario Douglas and Kayshawn, as you mentioned, were quite involved. But you can throw all of those names out there, and none of them really move the needle at all. The one guy that they have who does something in this offense is Hunter Henry. I'd still like to think that Mike Gesicki is going to bring a little bit of athleticism. I'm not saying rush out there and spend a ton of money on Kendrick Bourne, but I don't think that we can write him off either, knowing what we know about his ability to create big plays in an offense that may throw a lot more passes than people are thinking and that desperately needs this receiving option.
So we're going to go rapid fire, Shawn, through a couple of games here to see if there's any final thoughts we want to give on the week. We had the Ravens winning pretty comfortably against the Houston Texans. The Texans look like a team that are going to pretty much struggle throughout the entire season. We did get 21 combined targets to Nico Collins and Robert Woods in this, 10 for Woods, 11 for Collins. Collins getting 6 for 80. Maybe something to watch. I do feel like it's going to be quite concentrated on those 2 guys getting targets throughout the entire season. On the other side, obviously, we know that J.K. Dobbins picked up the injury, was looking really good at that particular time. But the other keynote, Shawn, I think, is Zay Flowers. It was a game that they didn't have Mark Andrews, but he gets 10 targets, 9 receptions, 78 yards, and he just looked open every single time Lamar Jackson looked towards him. I guess the player who didn't get the work that maybe people may have been anticipating was Rashad Bateman. He gets 3 targets, 3 receptions, 35 yards going his way. The other game I want to mention is the Titans and the New Orleans Saints. In this one, we do get another nice day from Chris Olave. He looked excellent. Looked kind of what we've seen last year, taking another step forward. He goes 10 targets, 8 receptions, 112 yards. Rashid Shaheed was heavily involved too, 5 receptions, 89 yards, 1 touchdown. And Michael Thomas was involved early and did look pretty good, in fairness to him as well. 8 targets, 5 receptions, 61 yards. Derek Carr, 305, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. On the other side, a lot's been made of the running back touches or the running back workload. Derrick Henry versus Tyjae Spears. A lot of Spears' work coming in the fourth quarter as they attempted that comeback. And then the other side of it would be Treylon Burks' lack of usage, 3 targets, 2 receptions, 18 yards on that side. And I guess lack of usage, Sean, we can put Chika Okonkwo in there as well. 2 targets for him, but 0 receptions. Obviously, some positivity in the draft community drafting Okonkwo this offseason, but didn't produce that in week 1. Any thoughts from either of those 2 games?
Yeah, I haven't had a chance to dive into these as closely as the rest, but I think that you've got to have a lot of enthusiasm for, as you mentioned, the concentrated targets there. Houston will see what Tank Dell does. I guess I'm not surprised that Bateman isn't heavily involved after all of the time that he missed. If you are a Bateman drafter, and we definitely are and were, because of the price there with a player who has that much talent, I think what you're looking for is not week 1 or even weeks 2 or 3. You're looking for this week 4 to week 17 situation. It does become more difficult if Zay Flowers is that good. I guess I'm not nearly as worried about Odell Beckham, but when Mark Andrews comes back, you'll have another mouth to feed there. The situation in Tennessee was always going to be tricky. It was this question of how much volume would DeAndre Hopkins get in contrast to those other 2 names you mentioned. For that reason, certainly once it looked like Burks was going to be back and relatively healthy, it didn't seem like Okonkwo was draftable. Again, it's just been 1 week. Dallas Goedert didn't do anything in week 1. You're going to have some of these guys who bounce back and have big games subsequently, so I don't think that we can write him off. But the thesis there, it looks more or less right through 1 week. With Treylon Burks, it's kind of the same situation as with Bateman, where it was really encouraging that he was able to get back quickly from that injury. Wouldn't expect him to be a big part of the attack in week 1, although it is disappointing because you were hoping that he would be. And to see it work out like this, to see Westbrook-Ikhine get the 7 targets, the biggest concern is just that Ryan Tannehill was awful, completes less than half of his passes, throws 3 interceptions. It's just non-competitive. It didn't sound like Will Levis had a good camp, even though there were some individual good plays. This is a team that obviously doesn't think they can get it done with Tannehill. They've taken QBs in back-to-back drafts. Both of those QBs in the early going look like busts. I mean, this is probably kind of the light version of the Jets situation with Zach Wilson, where I'm concerned here. I'm interested to watch the game because occasionally you'll find out that there were a lot of things that could have happened that didn't happen. Certainly this is a game where even though the Saints seem to play pretty well, the Titans seem to play pretty poorly. The Titans were flagrantly robbed of a fumble 6, and that would have been a 10-point swing. And so then the Titans, everything else in the game would have changed from that point. The game context changed. How you have to play it is different. And yet, this is a weird one because the Titans were robbed by the officials. So from that perspective, one of the things we talked about the Packers game on Sunday night. I hadn't had a chance to watch it at that point. I have since watched it, and I was disappointed because Jordan Love actually didn't look very good. And I was hoping with the stat line, with the final numbers, that he looked like he was ready to make the leap. I'm still hoping for you and for Packers fans that he looks better. I mean, Matt LaFleur had a magnificent game. He was getting guys wide open everywhere. Love still had a hard time getting them the ball. You know, the coaching situation there is fantastic. I think, you know, you guys are set for, you know, however long he can do it. The main thing that jumped out is the Chicago Bears are an absolute train wreck. So we'll see how some of those things go. Obviously, Justin Fields, another one of those guys who, even though he was going a round or two, sometimes three later than like the elite QBs, he also didn't come through in week one. So there weren't a lot of paths from those elite quarterbacks to get the job done in the first weekend. Colm Shaheed, that's the guy there where I think that there's a very real chance that this season with Puka, with Rashid, and with Kendrick Bourne, that at least one, if not two of those guys are for real and score a lot of fantasy points for people going forward.
Interesting. We'll see how that plays out. Shawn, we did mention at the start of the show, we are going to play it out now. A few clips that may make it into the intros. If people see in week 2 clips of players that think should make it in, let me know. We'll lock them up and we'll try and get them in. But here are a few that are leading contenders. There'll be no surprise as to which names are in the list.
Garrett Wilson. Wow! What a catch! It's Howell. It's Howell. Touchdown! Handoff is to Hall. There goes Breece.
ETN bounces. Uh-oh, the trouble. ETN to the end zone. Touchdown.
I have to say I love and I don't think it'll make it into the final cut because it's too long. The ETN bit, I will have to cut out the I love
Colm, that's the best part.
That is the best part, but I want it to be like 15 seconds long, so we'll see if that makes it in. But yeah, looking forward to seeing what comes up in week 2 that may bump those options. But let me know. They were my picks from week 1. Shawn, that is going to do it for our show today. We will be back with our Friday edition of RotoViz Overtime. Make sure you're subscribed to the podcast feed to get those once they are available. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at Overtime Ireland. My co-host is Shawn Siegele. Check out all of Shawn's work up on rotoviz.com. And until we are back, have a good one.